So in this lesson, we'll start looking at Unit 14 with international trade and looking at comparative advantage and the benefits of trade. So we begin with Principle 5 in your first lesson that we did, which is trade can make everyone better. No country can produce everything they need for every person living within its borders. It's just simply not possible. So trade, therefore, is a necessity in order for countries to acquire goods that they need. So you must trade to acquire what you cannot or what you should not produce. Just because you can produce something doesn't mean that you should actually do it. There are situations in which the United States could produce an awful lot of goods, but we don't because it's not to our advantage. So maximizing your available factors of production means using them as efficiently as possible. And that really is the key here, is that our goal is to maximize what resources we have available to us, to use them as efficiently as we possibly can, and then to purchase the goods that we simply cannot produce efficiently. So trade allows countries to maximize their use of their available factors of production and allows them to focus on their advantages. Individuals and nations rely on specialized production and exchange. And this is how they address problems caused by scarcity. For example, if you look at the different types of goods that countries are importing, they're importing those goods because those goods in their country are scarce. For example, have you ever seen a coffee plant growing in the United States? You haven't, because they won't grow here. So if we were to try to grow them, it would cost us a significant amount of resources and time to be able to pull that off. Well, why waste those resources and why waste those times on a good that we can simply get from somewhere else? So when you are scarce on certain types of goods, that's how you acquire them. And that also at the same time creates interdependence between those trading. If two countries are trading with each other, then both of those countries want the other country to be successful, because that means that they were able to A, sell more of their good, but B, also buy more of what they need. So people are better off when they specialize and trade with others. In the long run, countries are better off when they utilize trade. Now, patterns of production and trade are based upon differences in opportunity cost. And that's going to be the real key of this lesson, is understanding that what we make and why we make it is based entirely on the opportunity cost of making those goods. Okay, so let's look at something we've talked about previously, which is geographic specialization. This is probably the most common and most easy way to understand what's going to take place. So specialization allows nations to focus on the production of particular goods and services. Rather than all goods and services, you produce what you do best, and then you get the other items from other locations. And this allows workers to focus on a single task. So it creates greater efficiency and more productivity within the economy. Now, when that specialization results from some geographic advantage, which is often the case, for example, climate or elevation, we have what we call geographic specialization. We're going to use coffee as an example here. So coffee bean production. So we look at this bag of coffee beans and these coffee plants. Well, it's based on climate, and there's what we call a bean belt in which coffee beans can be grown. So if you look at this map, you'll notice very clearly there's an area there just below and above the equator in which the climate is just right for the production of coffee beans. And as a result, we see that only those countries are the ones producing. Now, when you look at it in more detail, you can see here where the world's coffee come from. So there's two primary types of coffee beans that are being produced and being traded or sold across the globe. One is Arabica and the other is Robusta. So Brazil is the largest producer of Arabica beans in the world, while Vietnam is the largest producer of Robusta beans. Now, you'll notice that a lot of countries are only producing one type of bean, and that is Arabica. And we're going to look at why that is. And then you'll notice with Robusta, you see there Indonesia, India, Uganda, Ecuador. You've got these countries over here to the left, Vietnam, Angola, Philippines. So these countries are producing different types of beans. And then you have a few countries that produce both types, like Brazil, for example, is able to produce both types of beans. Now, that's important because when you look over here at the import share of U.S. food consumption, notice that that coffee, cocoa, and spices are the largest grouping of items in which the United States imports for consumption. So coffee is one of the single biggest imports from a food consumption standpoint in the United States. Now, when we look here at the difference between the two beans, one of the things I wanted to put on here is to notice the elevation differences. So where are these beans produced from an altitude perspective? So Arabica beans, which are more expensive and dominate 70% of the world's production, are produced at altitudes of 800 meters plus. Robusta, on the other hand, has twice the amount of caffeine. It's commonly used in instant coffees, and it's produced at lower altitudes. So when we look at the difference, we can see and get a good idea of what type of beans are imported. Arabica is going to be the most common type of bean imported into the United States, but when it comes to instant coffee, it is the Robusta. So this gives us an idea from that geographic standpoint of who's producing what and why. So trade is based on what we call comparative advantage. So what determines specialization? Well, it's comparative advantage. The comparison among producers of a good according to their opportunity cost. And the producer with the smallest opportunity cost has a comparative advantage in production. So that's the key here. Trade is based on comparative advantage. Comparative advantage is determining which producer has the smallest opportunity cost. So the climate that runs through the bean belt creates a comparative advantage for those countries in the production of coffee beans. Could the United States produce coffee beans? Sure. Would it cost us a much higher opportunity cost than that of, say, Brazil? Absolutely. Therefore, we don't do it. And this is why the U.S. does not produce its own coffee beans. So let's look at an example of comparative advantage. So we're going to take a farmer and rancher that live next to each other. Now, both can grow potatoes and raise cattle at the same time. For the farmer, 1 pound of potatoes for every half pound of meat he decides not to produce. So in other words, the farmer can say, okay, the less cattle I have, the more potatoes that I can produce. You can see there, he's going to give up a half pound of meat for every pound of potatoes. Now look at the rancher though. He must give up 8 pounds of meat to produce 1 pound of potatoes. So should the rancher even attempt to grow potatoes at all? Well, obviously based on this opportunity cost, no, he's given up too many pounds of meat. So the farmer should specialize in potatoes, while the rancher should specialize in cattle, and then they should trade with each other. And then this creates the greatest amount of productivity. And that's the key here, is by trading you increase your productivity levels because you're not wasting resources on an item you shouldn't be producing. So when you compare the cost of production, you can compare the hours required to produce a unit of output, or you can compare the opportunity cost. Now, absolute advantage, if you compare two countries to determine who is the most productive, then you're measuring how quickly they can produce a unit of output, determining who has the absolute advantage. Now, what's important here about this absolute advantage is that whoever requires a smaller quantity of inputs is said to have an absolute advantage. However, you can have an absolute advantage over someone, but better off not producing the good and trading. And that's kind of the key, is that the United States could establish a way that would allow them to produce coffee beans at a faster rate than Brazil. But would that still be the right decision to make? Probably not, because even though we could produce them much faster, how much resources, how much would it take for us to actually pull that off? So you're better off not producing the good and trading because of opportunity cost. So to work that out and how it looks, we're going to look at opportunity cost in detail. So I've got this here before specialization in production and then after specialization in production. We're looking at laptops and t-shirts with country A and country B. So country A can produce 10 laptops in 30 minutes. They can also produce 10 t-shirts in 30 minutes. So in an hour of time, they can produce 10 laptops and 10 t-shirts. So before trade, country A can produce 20 laptops an hour or 20 t-shirts an hour. And then if they split the time, they can produce 10 of each. So that's what country A has the ability to do. 20 an hour of one, 20 an hour another, or 10 of each. Country B, on the other hand, can produce 2.5 laptops in that same 30 minutes, but 15 t-shirts in that same 30 minutes. So country B can produce 5 laptops an hour or 30 t-shirts an hour. So if they split the time, then we see 2.5 laptops and 15 t-shirts. So that's their possibilities. Either they can go all or none. Now, because there's no trade taking place, they have to produce both because there's no trade. So in order for country A and country B to both have laptops and t-shirts, they have to produce them themselves. And that's the situation in which they sit currently. Now, with trade, though, that changes. With trade, country A can produce 20 laptops in an hour of time and focus on t-shirts none at all. So country A makes 20 laptops and trades five for 10 t-shirts, resulting in 15 laptops and 10 t-shirts with trade compared to 10 and 10. So you see what happens here. So country A makes 20 laptops. They take 5 of those and trade them for 10 t-shirts. That gives them 15 laptops and 10 t-shirts compared to where they were at 10 and 10. Now country B decides to not produce any laptops at all. They focus on t-shirts, producing 30 an hour. So country B makes 30 t-shirts and trades 10 for laptops. As a result, they have 5 laptops and 20 t-shirts, compared to where earlier they were at 2.5 and 15. So when you look at specialization in the two areas, both country A and country B benefit from specializing and then trading. So through specialization based on opportunity cost, country A produces 20 laptops an hour. Country B produces 30 t-shirts an hour. Before trade, we see where they were. Combined, the two countries were producing 12.5 laptops and 20 t-shirts in an hour. Combined. After trade, the countries produced 20 laptops and 30 t-shirts. So overall, trade allows both countries combined to produce more t-shirts and more laptops. So let's graph what we were looking at. So the green line here is going to represent the production possibilities frontier for country A. So remember when we talked about these, the idea being that they can produce at any point along the line. Anything inside the line is inefficient because they're not using resources, and anything outside the line is impossible from what they can produce. So point 1 is going to represent their current production of 10 laptops and 10 t-shirts. So that location right there represents splitting the 30 minutes and producing 10 and 10. Now the blue line is the production possibilities frontier for country B. Point 2 represents their current production of 2.5 laptops and the 15 t-shirts, which is right there, that 30 minutes and 30 minutes. So at this point, you can clearly see the production possibilities curves for both country A and country B and where they're located. Now, point 3 is going to represent the laptop production for country A after trade. So it's up here, 0 t-shirts, but they're producing 20 laptops. So you can see there where that point is. Now, when we look at the next point here, point 4 represents the t-shirt production for country B at 30 t-shirts and 0 laptops. So that's where they're at. Now, when we put that together, because of trade, country A now has 15 laptops and 10 t-shirts, which is represented by point 5. Notice that. So trade allows country A to produce beyond its production possibilities curve, its frontier there. They're able to acquire above that line, which remember we'd said the only way possible to do that, of course, in their country would be to increase their technology to allow them to do so. But instead of doing that, they can trade and thus expand to outside of the production possibilities frontier. At the same time, because of trade, country B now has 5 laptops and 20 t-shirts represented by point 6 here. So both countries benefited from trade by the fact that they were able to expand beyond the production possibilities frontier. So that's why countries trade, because of what it allows them to do when they begin to specialize in the production of goods. So let's go back and look at comparative advantage. Comparative advantage compares producers of a good based on opportunity cost. So the producer with the smallest opportunity cost of producing a good holds a comparative advantage in producing that good. So that's what your goal here is to gain that opportunity cost, and that comparative advantage is based on that. So therefore, they should specialize in the production and trade of that good, and then of course trade for the goods they don't produce. So specialization increases the overall level of the economy. Now, in conclusion, absolute advantage focuses on who uses the fewest resources. Comparative advantage focuses on what else those resources could have produced. Opportunity cost of those resources is the big deal here. So when absolute advantage goes in and they say, okay, we can produce this good the fastest using the fewest resources. Well, that doesn't mean that you should do it though. Rather, comparative advantage is focusing on the opportunity cost of those resources to determine what you should and should not produce. So from a global perspective, resources are allocated most efficiently when production and trade conform to the law of comparative advantage. So trade benefits everyone in society because it allows people to specialize in activities in which they have a comparative advantage and create a division of labor within a factory system, thus allowing factories to produce in the most efficient way the most amount of goods. So, and from a trade perspective, how is trade benefiting us in other ways? How does overall trade benefit the globe? One, it creates a greater variety of goods and services. Two, it increases competition and efficiency within the markets. So that's anytime you increase competition and efficiency, you're creating better quality goods and, of course, goods with greater variety. It bolsters economic growth and development. When countries are able to trade, it generates greater economic growth because they're able to import all these goods that they have not accessed before while focusing on the goods that they do best. It also, of course, forces them into economic development and the creation of transportation systems, road systems, communication systems. All of these things come out of this trade. There's a flow of new ideas as well. In fact, the single largest export from the United States in reality is our information as opposed to, say, our goods that we produce, because we're not really a manufacturing country anymore. It also reduces international hostilities. China and the United States have been at odds with each other for decades now over different issues, but those two countries are very unlikely to go to war with each other because of the fact that they have such a strong trade relationship. The simple fact that Chinese goods are being purchased in overwhelming numbers by Americans means that the Chinese don't want to mess up our economy because we're the ones buying their goods. And then needed resources are acquired. No country has all the resources they need in order to be successful. Therefore, they need to be able to acquire resources from other places. Well, trade facilitates that, of course.